listeners. I am super excited to be talking to Grisha Stewart, as always. I mean, I love talking to you. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Marissa. Always a pleasure.
And I'm really excited to be talking about sort of your new brainchild. Like it's, can I call it your brainchild?
Yes, I like that. It definitely resonated. I have brain babies.
Yeah. It's like your little brainchild. So I remember talking to you a few months ago when you had just gotten this textbook on attachment theory and I was like, oh my gosh, attachment theory in our relationships with our dogs, like get out.
Oh.
Yeah. Like mind blown. Like Grisha and I are always on the same page. You're a bunch of pages before me.
No, you don't have to say that.
However, we resonate. We
have books that are on the same theme, and we're like, "Hey, have you read this?" No.
Exactly.
In our, life pages.
Yes, and we love the same stuff, basically.
Yes.
And so I'm really excited to talk about attachment theory and, like where this all began for you. So let's first identify like what is attachment theory. We'll start off with the human side of things. And I just want to hear about your story about how the brainchild was born.
Sure. So attachment theory started with John Bowlby in the 50s, and it started from an ethological perspective, not a psychological perspective, which is great because then that really matches what we do, right, with animals or non-human animals. And basically the idea is that we mammals and other beings become attached for our own survival, right? So it's an evolutionary tactic. And it's also, if you can look at it through the lens of learning theory, which he didn't do, it's a learned skill as well. So it's something we evolved to sort of have, and then it shows up in ways that are dependent on the environment. And so there's secure attachment, which is the idea that we are comfortable loving, expressing love, and then receiving love. So we are more comfortable with needing someone, with relying on interdependency, and then having other folks be able to count on us. So that's secure. That's about 40% of the people, which is a startlingly low number. And then there's the other 60% are some sort of insecure. So there's anxious, which is basically, I see it as an anxious attachment being that people are afraid of the other one abandoning them, so that they can't count on the relationship being stable. And then there's also avoidant, which is the flip side of that. So the sort of the fear is, it's still anxious though, actually. I think it's a bit of a misnomer, but the anxiety there is that they'll be sort of swallowed up, so that the avoidant folks are not wanting other people to count on them. So there's the ability to set boundaries reduces the anxiety that comes with avoidant attachment. And then there's the sort of the hardest version to be in relationship with, which is the avoidant and anxious, which is also called disorganized. And so this is where it ties into my story, because that's what I was when I, finally got around to reading it. It was like, oh God, that's what went wrong with all of my relationships. So yeah. And then seeing that not just humans have this, but also dogs, and they're starting to become more and more evidence that that's a thing. And now I realize that we need to weave that officially into dog training as a structure, to decide what we do, what kind of interventions we can do, and ways we can interact with dogs.
Yeah. And I have a question about attachment theory in the sense that, like, so I am also working through being disorganized, so anxious avoidant or fearful avoidant. And so does that, like, I would imagine that how I show up behaviorally, right? How I express that attachment style that I have, I would imagine that the antecedent or the conditions in the environment are going to either escalate that style or maybe de-escalate that style. Is that true in me assuming that like, or am I going to show up the same regardless of the conditions?
So I consider it basically like a response class. So basically so the attachment, like we have a need to, I'm going to rewind a little bit on answering that. So attachment is basically we have proximity seeking, so wanting to be around our attachment figures. We also have safe haven, so meaning that the attachment figure is the safest place to go if there is some sort of threat in the environment. And then there's also secure base, so a place from which we can go explore, and then we start checking to say, hey, attachment figure, are you still there? And so there are some folks, the 40%, who learned that those things are just something you can count on. You don't have to worry that those will go away. And so for those of us who have had experiences in which those aren't always reliable, especially when really young, and also there's some evolutionary aspect to it, sort of what we brought into the picture. But for those of us in that insecure category, our systems get activated quickly. So we recognize the signs of the attachment breaking, or sort of looking like it might break. And we're not as used to the concept of sort of rupture and repair. So a secure relationship, basically there's rupture and repair, and it happens all the time, and it's really smooth and easy. And so there's sort of fewer and fewer ruptures, or if there is a rupture, it's small. So our ability to notice the rupture is really, really fine-tuned. And that's, in a way, that's a really good thing. That's a skill we bring, right? Is to notice those repairs or those ruptures. And so once we have the skills to do repair, we can be very good at being sort of, as secure as someone needs, except that we are going to be activated. We're going to be noticing those times of rupture. And so we are more sensitive in the sense that we notice more. And so, yes, it's environmental in the sense that that's what we're noticing and that's what we're responding with, but we can retrain ourselves to have a different actual response behavior, right? That first piece might be, whoa, everything, sort of the autonomic response of the attachment system getting triggered. And then immediately, because we've done the work, then sort of comes the next piece of, oh, this is my attachment system. Thank you, attachment system. Now I'm going to do this other thing. And so,
I see.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. And I'm wondering too, like, the word perceived keeps coming up for me because if we're talking about anxious, right? Or we're talking about anxiety, like a perceived threat in the environment. Threat. So it's like, it might not even be a rupture according to the other person, but according to me, that's really sensitive to any sort of rupture or change in my environment. I may perceive it as threatening, and therefore, like you said, get activated, and therefore lean into a particular behavior pattern of reacting, right? Or taking a breath and asking myself, right, is this true? Or does this need my attention, or whatever, to help like soothe my nervous system?
Exactly. Like a dog that has separation anxiety, right? You can also see it as sort of this sort of permanently sensitized state, right? So they're sensitized to that rupture. And so, we sort of focus a lot on the separation piece, on like making sure that they're comfortable with the separation. But ultimately, if we can work on the secure attachment in general, then my experience and my thought is that we have less of the separation anxiety in the first place. That it's just the behavioral expression of the secure attachment, being at risk as far as they're concerned, right? So they're sensitized, and they're seeing there's a perceived threat when there really isn't one, right?
Yeah. Okay. Super helpful.
Yeah. And I think also that there are a lot more threats than people sort of are aware of, right? I've been paying attention to sort of microaggressions, where people do sort of small, and this is back to human stuff, but we will get to the dogs. But there's just these little small digs here and there, right? That people will do. And so that's something that people who are more sensitive might notice that, and might not even be like, they might be aware of it happening, but might not notice that sort of on a cognitive level that it's happening. So a person who actually has an anxious attachment style can ultimately end up being like a really good partner, because they're noticing like, ooh, there's a spot where we could actually smooth over, there's a little a piece of discomfort that we're having that actually we can smooth it over now before it becomes something large.
Yep. Yeah.
So that sensitivity can be useful.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So
with our dogs as well.
With our dogs, yeah, because you have a really awesome acronym and you have some pillars of secure attachment and what that looks like. So let's talk about what that is with our dogs.
Sure. So with dogs, and this had evolved from basically the 5 pillars for humans, but so felt safety, having consistency, reliability, and protection. So again, that the human is somebody that they can count on for it being a safe space. And so when we think about the various different training styles, one may wonder, is there a sense of felt safety for the dog? So this, I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here and say that with punishment training, there are certain kinds of punishment training where it's not clear to the dog who gave the punisher. And so the human is actually the safest place, because if they go too far away, the dog is getting a shock. So in some sense, there is felt safety around the human, but just sort of the irony is that the human is the one causing the danger in the first place. So being consistent where it actually truly is safer to be around you. Attunement, being seen and known. So the dog is able to express what they need. So I have this video called Talk With Me, where basically we look at ways that we can observe dogs and see what it is that they want, and also communicate what we want. So attunement, felt comfort, soothing when distressed, being valued. So being able to know that the human delights in their presence, and that these are all, consistently available as much as possible. So the dog is, if they were to have a little thought bubble above their head, they would say that the human is glad of my company, right? So when the dog rushes to the door and they're super excited to see us, and then we yell at them because they've jumped on our nice dress or something, then that is a rift that's a rupture in the attachment system, right? So even if we turn away, again, that's still a rupture. It's not as bad as sort of experiencing pain probably. But if we were to just give the dog a station to go to and then greet us with enthusiasm, and we can greet them back, then that's better for the dog's attachment system and ours. So felt safety, attunement, felt comfort, being valued, and then also support to explore. And that's something where a lot of folks who have more anxious attachment styles fall down on, I would say, is giving the dog a chance to go be a dog. So consistent, reliable, and unconditional support for their exploration versus having the dog walk to heel or walk, focused on us the entire time. That soothes our attachment systems, right? To have the dog attuned to us. And yet then it makes it less likely that they're then sort of being a full dog, right? So their support to explore is important.
I love that. And I would imagine that, again, you're talking about this through the behavior lens, right? You're also we don't know if a dog feels valued, right?
We can't ask them, right?
We can't ask them, or
how do you feel about this?
Exactly. But we can, or we don't know, there's a big word in our profession, like trust, right? Do you trust your dog? Does your dog trust you? It's we don't necessarily know the answer to those questions, but what we can do is observe behavior to see whether or not what we perceive that behavior is a felt comfort, is felt safety, right? So I love the examples that you're giving. So it's not just this ethereal, yeah, your dog feels comfortable. We don't, the only way we can know that is through behavior and through observation in a variety of contexts.
Right.
Yeah.
And the reason that I state it this way is so that our intention is to help the dog feel comfortable, right? So whether it's working or not is something that we have to observe with our eyeballs, and with, sort of being attuned to the dog. And so in the book that's coming out soon, it'll have, more information specifically of, what does that look like? Yeah. So, there's an article on my website already that goes through some more details in terms of kind of questions you can ask yourself about an intervention or an activity that you're doing to see, does this drive here? So is the dog reliably safe from harm and intimidation? is the family at least trying to provide experiences that are safe for the dog,
Mhm.
and all these different steps. So yeah. And I do want to say here that that this is a work in progress, as all of the things that I do are. And so I'm happy to this is my contribution to the conversation. I'm happy to hear other people's ideas of, okay, this would be more measurable if we put it this way, or
Mhm.
whatever else. And also the caveat that attachment theory is originally started from a very Western perspective, particularly a white Western perspective, and that attachment looks different in different communities and in different cultures. And so the goal with the research, right, is to bring it down to the most the sort of species and beyond species level of like, what do we all do? But it's always going to show up slightly differently in context, because these are adaptations to an environment. So if the environment itself is not safe, then secure attachment would look differently.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
I would wanted to share a little bit about my experience with the dogs that I have in my house, because it's an ironic situation that, we had to push this podcast recording back because you had all these amazing things happening, right? You got married. Congratulations.
Yay.
You went to Iceland, you were off, right? So,
Yeah.
and it's funny that we're having it this week, because right now I have these two dogs in my home, and we're not calling them quote unquote bonded or attached. However, they were found together. They have been through a lot together. They have not been separated that we know of. They're in my home to help them transition to Colorado since they came from out of state. And I'm hoping to choose one of them, which I have chosen, to be my dog. And so there's a whole thing about, how, do we separate them? Do we not? We're trying to work that out right now. And obviously I will make the choice to do what's right for the dogs, and not necessarily for what I want. But putting that aside, it's interesting. I wound up reaching out to this rescue because of the white Goldeny Pyrenees mix. And when I got them in the home, there's his Cotton, he's golden mix, like I said. And then there's Joe, Cotton Eye Joe. So then there's Joe, who is like a black labby mix. And it was funny, I was interested in Cotton because, as we know, Sully was black labby Pyrenees mix. And so I didn't want a dog that looked the same. And yet it's funny because Cotton very much reminds me of Sully personality wise, and Joe is very different than Sully, which is why I'm sort of falling in love with him.
Mhm.
And I've been thinking about my attachment style a lot this week, because when I think about Sully, he didn't really need me. Like, he was the perfect dog for me to have when I was young and naive. And like, he's a pretty secure dog. Like, yes, he had some reactivity at times. And yet, like, when I think back now to it, it was really mild. And so we were in parallel. Like, we didn't really need each other as much. And that really worked for me. Like, I was aware of it. It really worked for me. We got a lot closer as I became more in tune with who I am in relationship, obviously. But it's funny. I was saying that, I said this to Kathy Sadeo once. I was like, I just want like a little sprinkle of neediness, just like a little bit more, like not a lot, just a dash or whatever. And Joe has this. Joe is very much like, he looks to Cotton for information. He looks to me now for information. Like, he definitely needs that security. Right. And it's funny because it's something I desire. And yet the avoidant part of my anxious avoidance style is like, this is a little too much. Right. And so I've been talking about it with a colleague this week. I'm just like, oh, this is so funny. Like, how I desire for this deep connection. And yet it's like, ooh, it's a little scary.
Don't
for
want to
me.
be counted on for
I
this.
don't want to be counted. Yes. And so like, it even brings tears to my eyes a bit. And so and then there's just been so many serendipitous things that, like, I didn't know that your dog was named Joe. Like, I just, there's a lot of things that I'm like, okay, I might have to just realize that this is my dog and this is my new growth opportunity. And so it's, I think it's serendipitous that we're talking about this and how I'm noticing their attachment and how they rely on one another. And then how I'm attached to Joe, and then how I'm nervous about the attachment. So you're onto something. I mean, you're always onto something, Grisha, because you're brilliant, but
I try.
there's something here that I think is so, that can be articulated in a way to our clients to see, like, when we get, like you said, activated, right? Like, I'm like, oh, you need too much. And then do I get easily frustrated because now I'm feeling like I don't have a boundary with you or whatever, or when you're further away from me, then I want you to be close to me. Right. It's that, that's why it's called disorganized, right? It's sort of, it's like push pull, right? So yeah, I just wanted to
be here
share
exactly when I need you to be here, and leave me alone the rest of the time.
Exactly. I had my neighbor recently, he's so funny. He sent me a text being like, your needs are fast and ever changing. I don't understand how Scott deals with that. I was like, hit the nail on the head, pal. Like, but anyway,
and let me circle back a little bit to say we are only as needy as our unmet needs. So if it's sort of an assessment, and when there's a dog that does need something, to say, like, can I meet that need? Is it something that I'm willing to commit to, offering to that dog? And I think we would have probably a lot less rehoming if we were to look at attachment styles when sort of pairing dogs together, or dogs with humans.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier on saying, we don't want to say that they're bonded or they're attached. But I, through my head, I sort of flicked through the three kind of pieces of attachment style: the proximity seeking, the safe haven, and the what's the third one? Secure base.
Secure.
And so do they sort of, I mean, there is a sort of a sibling bond that can happen as well. And so do they, are they that to each other? So if we were to tick through each 100%. Of those.
Yeah. And I have gone back and forth with the rescue being like, I don't think we should separate them. And then there's suspect that they are potentially litter mates, maybe different dads. And I'm like, oh, like, so they're like, we're not going to keep them together anyway. Right. So there's all this stuff about it, but I think being the one to make the decision is really hard for me. Like seeing these dogs together and seeing that they are those three pillars. I'm like, ooh, ripping that apart from someone is traumatic.
Right. And I think there's so much in dog care, that is, it's sort of us making these decisions for the dogs. And so more and more we're doing it on the dog's behalf as well. But if we were to sort of like give them a vote, like what would they vote for? Right?
Totally.
Yeah. And of course, recognizing like the limits of your own capacity for time, and, 2 dogs is definitely more than twice the work, than one. So, keeping that in mind as well. But, a lot of our ways of choosing is sort of like only, how does it fit into our human lifestyle? And that's, as trainers, that's what we bring to a lot of times, or historically, people have brought to the table, is like, okay, what's easiest for all the people here? But also then, if you were to give the dogs a vote, I'm just thinking now of that webinar that Sindor Pangal did on the Academy website. And, just sort of thinking of like, if Joe and Cotton were just like loose in the, if there were no fences, what would they do? Right.
Which like, they were,
right.
They were found abandoned in a campsite area, and they were together, right? Every time they were spotted, they were together. And so
they've already chosen each other.
Yeah. Oh, this is making me. Yeah. And as a side note, so we're not keeping 2 dogs, and if it's decided through we're doing some slow separation stuff just to see what happens. If it's decided that they have to stay together, then neither of them is my dog. And I'm totally prepared to make that choice. And it's been lovely because the adopters that are interested in Cotton, everyone wants to do what's right for these dogs, which is just like lovely that like everyone's rallying around them in that way, which is pretty cool. So
that's great.
Yeah. Not like, oh, he's a golden, I want him, moving on.
Nice.
So,
right. So.
Okay, great. So what's one thing? So if like there's pet parents listening right now, like what's one thing or maybe a resource or something that they could start looking into what their attachment style is?
So there are lots of really great quizzes online. So that's one thing I would just do for yourself is just like take an attachment style test just to see, and maybe do multiple ones just to make sure that, there's good reliability in it.
Yeah.
And I definitely would recommend that attached book. Definitely check that out. And, and reading the blog post that I wrote. And then I found it kind of fun to basically, well, actually, I didn't quite do it yet. I'm planning on doing it with my dogs, just sort of imagining if they were to fill out the questions. And I don't know any particular test that would be sort of more suitable to dogs or not. I'll track down a resource for you. There are definitely there are research papers on attachment styles in dogs, and so they must have had an instrument for testing that, so that we can test our own dogs as well. And so as the book develops, I'll probably have more resources too.
Yeah. Awesome. We're so excited about that.
Yeah. So, and that'll be woven into the B.A.T 3.0 book.
Perfect.
So, and I'll probably talk about it in the webinar too.
Yes. When is that webinar? Yeah.
October 26th is the webinar. So I don't know when this podcast
We'll make sure to
out,
get this out before then. Yeah.
Fantastic.
I will be there as well. I'm really excited for that.
Okay.
Anything else you want to say about attachment theory and style and our relationships with our dogs?
So one thing I would say is that always I want to be wary of labels, right? So once we find a label, we're like, this is me. And then we sort of like fit ourselves into it instead of, allowing that to be a human construct of the way things appear to be. And, that these are, like I said, response classes, meaning that they're like a group of ways that we might respond. And so the main thing I would say so that's one. And then the other thing I would say in terms of our dogs is to really be aware of the times that we get upset with our dogs, because a lot of times that is actually triggering our attachment system. And so to recognize in there, are we expecting more of our dogs than they can actually do, right? Because I think sometimes we are sort of attached to them almost like they were a parent versus a child, and we're expecting them to be consistent in the ways that we might want a partner or a parent to be, and they can't be, because they can't understand that need, right? They're just dogs. They're off chasing a squirrel or something. And so that sort of sense of betrayal that we sometimes feel can be our attachment system triggering.
Yeah. Really, really good point.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And so use positive reinforcement to teach them what you want.
Exactly.
In those cases where they don't understand.
No,
if it meets
there's no fallout there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, we will link to all the resources that you were talking about in the show notes so people can get started. And thank you so much for being here and talking about this. I'm really excited for more information from you.
Thanks, Marissa.